Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and I welcome all of you back to what is undisputably one of my favorite Chris Chan Cwiki articles, because this is one of those things that is very close to my heart, and for any and all business owners, small time, big time, I salute you because getting into a business, starting one up, doing what you love as a full-time profession is one of the most thrilling, one of the most exciting, one of the most rewarding, but it can also be one of the hardest things anybody can do because you are, as they say, throwing your hat into the ring. You are doing what you love and you want to be paid for what you do because of what you love. If you're good at something, you never do it for free, as they say. And when it comes to the topic of business, Chris Chan has attempted to start up his own business and make his Solitude brand a success. I mean, it makes sense. Chris has secretly always wanted Solitude to be a success. However, because of the nature of Solitude, its creation, its inception, it's sad to say that unfortunately Solitude will never come to fruition when it comes to being a business, or at the very least the one that Chris was probably expecting it to be. In some ways, I half expect Chris's sort of outcome when it came to Sonic is that Sega or Nintendo, maybe even both, will own separately the IP, and that they would be expected Chris to be paid out a royalty sum for his contribution. I'm assuming that's possibly what Chris may have had in mind. However, even from a business standpoint, that's probably the best I could have hoped for if I had created Sonichu. But of course, this was not to be. What did turn out to be is incredibly confusing and is almost a an example, if you will, almost like a step program of how not to run a business. And throughout this video, you're probably going to be hearing a few tips out of me because listen, I'll say it as it is. I have been doing freelance broadcasting for nearly 8 years now, and I only just started making money from this in the last 3 years. And you know what? Give it what it may be, I perceived it as more of a hobby when I first started doing this, but it was a hobby that did have some legs on it. And then once, as of course anything does have legs, you can get it to start to walk, and then you can get it to start running. And when it starts to run, ladies and gentlemen, it starts to pick up a few things as well. Money, at the end of the day, a revenue, something you could possibly live off. And whilst I will admit there were probably other avenues I could have gone down with this, I will admit this is just one of those things that I enjoy because not only do you get to discuss people's abnormalities, their quirks and whatnot, but you also get to explore possibly the reasoning why they are like this. And it's almost like holding up a mirror to somebody from a complete outsider. Because even though I've talked about lolcows, mainly Chris, for the last 6 years, Chris has yet to even so much as acknowledge that I spend so much of my time talking about him. Which again, you know what? For what that's worth, I am perfectly fine with it. Because the less I am involved in Chris-related business, the better. I'm just here to talk about it. That's all. It's the absolute perfect solution because it's not quite being an A-log. It's not quite being, a ween or anything like that. It's staying completely out of that ballpark, and it's just staying in the realms of commentary more than anything else. So, with all that being said and done, let's commence the business of the day. So, the first thing I want to draw your attention to is this very choice quote. That is not my fault, and that the frame got broke in transaction. The envelope was clearly marked fragile and handle with care, and it was shipped well in a bubble envelope. Either you, being trollish, or the postal carriers are to blame for the frame's arriving condition. This is an example of Chris's curt customer service skills. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I have to first, of course, impart a little bit of wisdom immediately. I spent almost the whole of 2025 working exclusively in the training of customer service. And one thing you are going to learn almost immediately is that when you are running a business or when you are running it by yourself, let me give you guys a few pointers insofar as I can work out. I am the broadcaster, the editor, the sound designer, the boom operator, the guy who does the graphics, the special effects, the thumbnails, the editing. But also, there's things aside. Once the work is actually published, you are HR representative. You are legal. You are the guy who is in charge of, well, every single facet of your operation is entirely on your shoulders. A business is a well-oiled, lubricated machine that is basically run on the strengths and the energies of one person, you. So when things do go wrong, actually when things do go wrong, when something arrives broken, I don't see this as a negative when somebody calls you out thinking that there's something that goes wrong. Because, you know what, things do go wrong. But this is an opportunity, believe it or not. Why is it an opportunity, you may be asking yourself? Because this is the opportunity to show that you are deeply sympathetic that that an accident or a misdeed happens. Because at the end of the day, the person, whether or not they were trollish or not, is a little bit out of the question, because you do sometimes, ladies and gentlemen, have to deal with inquiries of any particular nature at face value. But this is also why it's a good idea to read over complaints, comments, usually at least twice. And doing so, you can possibly detect if there's any hints of irony or sarcasm. A little bit of a hard thing to do for some people, but if you actually just pause and reflected on certain things a number of times, you can catch on sooner or later. Now, as to taking this as a matter as an opportunity, well, this is the opportunity to showcase that you care about this misfortune, and say, we do apologize that your arrival was shipped in broken. Would it at all be possible if you could provide exactly when, where this arrived, and we will do exactly what we can for you to arrive to give you a new frame, completely free of charge. Now, possibly the reason why we wanted to do this is because we want, again, the person who spent money on getting on what they asked for. We want to make sure that they go away happy, and regardless of whether or not it was marked as fragile, handle with care, and it was wrapped in bubble wrap or not, guess what? If it still breaks, it doesn't make something indestructible. So the only thing to do is, well, just go at it again. But when you have because what this does is that this builds customer business relations, in a sense that you could be trusted upon to do the responsible thing and acknowledge that this is a very unfortunate series of events, and whatever cases you make, well, guess what? If that's just what happens, then that's what happens. Which does, of course, raise the question: if this is somebody who may live in Virginia, why exactly Chris couldn't deliver the package in person? Although that might be going a little bit too far in this case. However, when you go for the impression of it's your fault, not ours, that's just something that doesn't happen. Because have you ever known to do any sort of business with anyone who literally points the fingers at you? And if there's one thing that Chris is always familiar with, it's the act of pointing the finger outward rather than inward. And you can't do that in business. Complaints, concerns, guess what? Whether you like it or not, you've got to do something about it. And Chris chooses not to. In fact, Chris just sort of wipes his hands of the whole affair and says, "It's your fault, not mine. Have a nice day." And of course, you apologize when you do get things wrong, because everyone at some point gets things wrong. even in business. But what can you do to make things right? That's the sort of thing that will always come back in one shape or form. Now, unfortunately, again, Chris is sadly never caught on to this, and this is just where we begin. We've been sat here talking about this for 10 minutes, but again, this is why it's such a fascinating point of contention. Because at the end of the day, if Chris wants to make money off this, then guess what? He's got to make sure you do this right, as I would. But let's get to the actual beginning, shall we, of Chris's business acumen, if you will. Chris launched an online business in June of 2014, selling custom arts and crafts through eBay. 1 year later, he moved shop to Etsy under a brand titled Quickfill Shopping. He also began selling printed copies of Sonichu on Lulu. He held a steady stream of customers despite issues with production and sending orders on time. For a while, he had achieved his dream of selling his own Sonichu merchandise and was making plenty of money. However, Chris's business ideas, roundabout towards the end of September of 2014, were met with many faults, such as a failure in order to keep up with demands and a business plan that seemed to reflect Chris's inflated sense of egotism. Something that you guys will be able to see in full force in a couple of moments' time. However, exactly 2 years and 1 week after the start of his business, on the 8th of June 2016, Chris's infamous laziness caught up to him, and he was banned from Etsy for ignoring orders over a span of months beginning from when he bought a PlayStation 4. He did not take responsibility for the self-inflicted failure of his business. Instead, he lied to save face and cast blame on Lulu.com's staff for having stressed him out by labeling Sonichu as fan fiction and banning his account for a year beforehand into December of 2016, even though he had actually ban evaded by opening a private account and was back to offering books through Lulu services only weeks later. And you can see almost immediately from before, Chris choosing not to do the things he was paid to do and violating the terms and service of a website. Ironically, it's the sort of thing that Lulu, Redbubble, Etsy, Zazzle, they take very seriously, because it outside of the fact that it means that it can open the floodgates. Things like fraudulent transactions, people selling stolen assets through Fiverr and stuff like that, and even if you want to go through the routine of, I don't know, Chris trying to sell his comics on Envato, for example, Envato, I don't think will accept Solitude comics as downloadable assets. I could be wrong about that. However, I have yet to see Envato use it, because I use Envato like every few months and stuff like that when I need to download assets. But I can hardly see them wanting to play ball, especially in regards to the natural of Sonichu's existence. Now, after the Etsy ban, Chris fell back on begging and paid video requests to cover Bob's credit card bills and his expensive toy purchasing. You can see from this almost immediately what Chris chose to prioritize. Actually, to be honest, Chris only prioritized this only when this was almost impossible to ignore. In May of 2017, he felt like returning to work on the Sonichu comic, and throughout the next several months, began to rebuild his business, using Patreon, Lulu, and Redbubble, and accepting interviews for money. So let's that's more the overview. So let's start at the very beginning. Storefronts. On the 1st of June 2014, Chris began cashing in on his internet infamy by offering custom artwork for sale. He later expanded his sales to include autographed photos, medallions, custom amiibos, and personal items related to Christery. This would be his most profitable and otherwise his most important commercial endeavor. Over the years, he would earn thousands of dollars by selling off Sonichu-themed memorabilia and sundries. The largest financial contributions were often made by aspiring weens to establish contact with Chris and put themselves in a friendly position. And even through reading that, guy, actually, can I just pause one moment and just say for the record, Jordan Belfort made more money in one summer selling Italian ices down in, I think was on the Jersey Shore, in one summer, probably than more than Chris ever made trying to sell off Sonichu. Jordan Belfort, bear in mind, guys, was the guy, the Wolf on Wall Street. But even when he did all that, even before he even got into college, I don't understand why Chris didn't think, maybe that would be a better idea, something that would have been far easier to make money out of. But questions like that are probably going to have to be answered or asked and never answered another day. He would not always fulfill his orders, however, and after receiving an abysmal 85% satisfaction rating through customer reviews, by the way, guys, 85% even on eBay is a devastatingly low evaluation. In fact, I think the only review I've actually ever seen that's lower than this, I think as low as about like 79.1%. And I'm pretty sure through what I saw for myself, I didn't buy anything, but I'm pretty sure they must have been entirely knockoffs or they were stolen goods, because the account, as far as I know, was suspended the very next day when I looked at it. His merchant account was suspended on the 16th of June 2019. Proposals to circumvent the ban for a partnership with Jacob Sockness were never implemented. Thank God for that. On the 2nd of September 2015, Chris expanded online businesses to Etsy. He continued the same offerings from eBay and added a donation listing for the continuation of the Sonichu series. Days later, on the 5th of September, a YouTuber named Dstex donated $1,000 thinking that Chris would deliver 100 pages of Sonichu. What actually happened was that Chris completed 16 pages before dropping the project. Yeah, $1,000 just to convince Chris to do 16 pages, and like, I'm not necessarily how much would that technically be? If my math is correct, and sometimes it is, you're talking about, like, isn't that roughly about the range of about $17.50 per page, as opposed to the actual $100 that Chris was commissioned to do. Either way, that's not good. And honestly, do you know any other comic book writers, artists, even concept artists for either DC, Dark Horse, Image, or Marvel getting paid $17 an hour even for that, or even $17 a page? I don't think it's the sort of thing that happens. This move remains controversial with historians, as while some believe that he honestly wanted Sonichu issue 11 to continue, others argue that this weenish move validated begging in Chris's eyes, as seen with the influx of begging videos in the financial crisis. And we will discuss the financial crisis at another time, because quite frankly, it's one of the most annoying aspects of Chris's business acumen, if you will. I'm going to include it as business acumen because technically Chris does it as a means of trying to open business relations, even if it does involve what is essentially begging, but that's a point for another day. In addition to Dstex, dozens of fans had also donated. Chris simply claimed that he was too stressed to continue Sonichu issue 11. Mind you, ladies and gentlemen, can I just say for the record right now, and a very short story, but let me fill you in, guys. 6 years ago, when I did a certain number of videos as requested by a Patreon donor on another channel, and after about a week, unfortunately the videos got taken down by YouTube, something to do with like copyright and stuff like that. Anyway, the point is that I messaged the person on Patreon immediately saying that unfortunately the videos got taken down, and I asked them very sincerely, because of what's happened, would they like to request a refund? Because I did open the possibility, because of course that's why I have my DMs open on Patreon, to say, would you like to request a refund? And the person on the other end very, very nicely said, no, no, that's honestly fine. We saw them and we were perfectly okay and stuff like that. But then I immediately followed this up by next saying, okay, in that case, through I won't disclose what they donated monthly and stuff like that, but I asked them, in that case, would you possibly like to request a charity that I would be able to send the money to? Because I'm not comfortable with the idea of um how short a time it was up, and I don't you know, it just something that would make sense. And they said, and again they said, no, it's perfectly fine. Now, I think actually what happened at the end is that I uploaded these things to like Daily Motion or Rumble or something like that. Um, but yeah, the again the point, the whole point being is that I still felt like it was worth defending my integrity and my reputation by offering people value for money. And I mentioned the thing about charity as a point of principle, because I think again that just seems like the responsible thing to do. Chris, on the other hand, seemingly just pockets whatever he's actually given. And if you think, but and again, I know what you guys are probably thinking to yourselves right now. I was not caught in the middle of a financial crisis, and you're right, I never was. But I also like to imagine, even way back when I was just 22 years old, I knew far better not to put myself into a situation. And I didn't even know what the financial crisis was back in 2020. So, and so what's Chris's excuse? Are you really trying to convince me that Chris was not old enough to know far better about his situation? Which, of course, is something that people do bring up a lot, but what can I say? I'm not Chris, and no matter how many times it's been told or advised Chris that, guess what, this is exactly what happened, Chris literally chose to hug his ducky muckera before anything else. Meanwhile, however, Chris still had a passion for making custom amiibos for several months afterwards. He took it seriously enough that he was willing to drive hundreds of miles through Virginia just to buy parts for amiibos to sell on Etsy. As a result, he wasted hundreds of dollars buying up amiibos on eBay, thinking that the market for his custom figures would sustain itself indefinitely. Chris is an idiot. And what was I saying about Chris's business acumen? Yeah, I don't even think. Do you think Chris could spell acumen? I know I can't, but yeah. This, however, of course, was not the case. Maybe that was one of the spare parts, is that Chris desperately needed a case to keep all his amiibos in. Yeah, just how robust and profitable is a hunk of plastic? You'd be better off stockpiling UB Funkies if that was the case. And Chris eventually grew apathetic and bored with earning his own money. That's a shock. To complicate things further, Chris purchased a PlayStation 4 in March of 2016. This new life upgrade proved far too distracting, and once again he started ignoring Etsy orders, often for months at a time. Ultimately, Etsy took notice and banned his store from doing business. And you can see from the way this all went, ladies and gentlemen, is that there's a bit of a repeating theme throughout all of this. Everything is somebody else's fault, and no matter what Chris does, someone else is to blame somehow. And listen, proud and completely selfish people do not make good business owners, because those are the sorts of people that prioritize only receiving money before anything else. And when I say anything else, that includes, but not limited to, actually doing things you are paid to do. Now, a lot of this could also be pointed out to Chris's appalling complacency, if you will, when it comes to actually working. Because even when I was 22 years old, ladies and gentlemen, I could say with absolute confidence that even by then, I had worked far more days, months at actual places of work than Chris had ever done in his entire life. Sooner or later, you begin to wake up and see the real world and understand exactly what you are involved in. But I think it's also because Chris is so utterly detached from the real world. Because the real world looks too inconvenient and too much of a sometimes you have to do things even if you don't want to do them, even if you are getting paid. All of that seemed far, far too much beyond Chris's sphere of comprehension. Or rather, Chris took part in it long enough to make him realize that he didn't want to be involved. As such, it doesn't seem completely unlogical, if you will, to arrive at the conclusion of, well, I'm just not going to do it because I'm not interested. If that's the case, then one wonders why, oh why, Chris wanted to continue doing business as long as he did. Well, I think as we mentioned before, it is because Chris was so hopelessly behind when it came to his business, his money, and things that, as I've proven time and time again, were absolutely Chris's own fault. And you know fine well that all of this could have been avoided if Chris had just thought twice about what he was doing or considered where he was in his particular space and time. Self-publishing. Chris took over a decade to try any self-publishing channels. Clyde Cash beat him to the punch by posting Chris's comics on Lulu.com. Chris simply retorted by encouraging his fans not to buy them, and simply wait for him to release the real versions later. According to emails from 2010, Chris claimed that he was working on fixing up the pages to be published on Lulu, taking an unreasonable amount of time to accomplish this amazingly simple task, and he eventually dropped the project. There's a shock. Undaunted, or whatever phrase you want to describe Chris began selling printed copies of the Solitary comic on Lulu.com in September of 2015, as well as offering autographed versions through Etsy by ordering the comics through Lulu, signing them, then shipping to the buyers. In December of 2015, Chris was banned from Lulu for selling fanfiction. In true Chris fashion, he responded by threatening Lulu's executives with physical violence. A very, very Chris thing to do when he doesn't get his own way. Chris is just, yeah, physical violence, really? Yeah. Do you see any business owners or high executives resorting to that childish and almost indictable levels of criminal activity just because they don't get their own way, because they refuse to follow the rules? Despite the fact that he was on probation for an act of violence against a GameStop employee, also true, Chris was able to continue selling comics in January of 2016. Probably rejoining Lulu under an alternative account, he was discovered within a few months, and again his account was shut down. Deprived of other reliable avenues, Chris has torpedoedly sought other ways to sell his own works, which included, but not limited to, opening a shop on Redbubble, an online shopping company where users can sell custom printed items based on images of the seller's choice. On the 3rd of October 2017, selling pictures of himself pre-Tom Girl and drawings of himself on frame pictures, pillows, and miniskirts. Yes, think guys, you can get pre-Tom Girl Chris Chan on a miniskirt. Isn't that the sort of thing that literally wets your whistle? Among others. Much later, on the 23rd of November 2019, the spiritual successor to Chris's Etsy opened as a new website of the name quickfillshopping.com. Here, Chris would offer his handmade trading cards for a My Little Pony themed game at extreme prices. This, of course, is nothing new, but what can you do? And when we say extreme prices, we'll be taking a look at those later. Commissioning. In December of 2015, the singularity happened. On Etsy, Chris offered to create a personalized video message for anyone who paid him $50. Now, bear in mind, guys, this was before apps like Cameo came to existence. But then again, considering that Chris is on Cameo anyway, but I think Chris might have some way have caught on that it didn't seem that reliable because I think Chris offers, I think it's about like $5 to book Chris through Cameo, but through other reasons I'll share momentarily, don't buy things from Chris or even commission him because, well, for reasons we'll get into later on. Many of his fans took him up on the offer, thinking that they would become a part of Christery by simply handing their money over to him. He received 4 sales within the first 3 days, although these customers opted for their videos to be unlisted, mostly because they didn't want their information leaked out to other trolls or even them on the Kiwi farms. Anyway, although these customers are unlisted, a few people also chose public videos for their birthday shoutouts. After losing his Etsy shop, Chris continued offering video requests through text messages, which is probably a fair idea. I mean, Chris could have done this through PayPal, but for whatever reason, Chris didn't just seem to. I don't even know if Chris even had PayPal back then. The videos Chris delivers are categorized by laziness. He has often been late on delivering, missing deadlines for birthday greetings, despite having an abundance of free time. Yeah, it's a little bit hard to, just that one alone is very hard to justify because how can somebody who is unemployed and is literally being given money knob over fist and they still can't just get on with it? How long would it take to do a birthday video, like 30 seconds, 1 minute? Guys, I could do that almost immediately. And I haven't even thought about the idea of doing Cameo because who on earth has heard of, well, this guy right here? Just saying. I know fine well which lane I'm in, and I'm not prepared to start thinking I'm above my station just because of what I do. Sloppiness. Chris chooses not to edit his takes or look in any way presentable. He has delivered a video featuring an upskirt shot of his maxi pad. Yeah. Also, explicitly stating that the content is boring. In many videos, Chris has mentioned his low opinion of his customers, saying things like, whatever, and wow, that's crazy, that's just, I feel like it's weird, whatever, while rolling his eyes. Chris, they're giving you money for doing not, let's be honest, Chris, they're giving you money for doing not that much work. Can you at the very least try, even if you are pretending, can you pretend to look a bit interested? 150, let's say, okay, let me put it to you guys like this. 3 orders in 4 days. From the Cwikis definition, what is that? $150 in the span of 4 days. That's how much is that? Are we talking about like at least like $37.50 a day? Are you really trying to tell me you can't pretend for someone who's unemployed, like Chris was? Are you really trying to tell me you can't look in any way interested for $37.50? They're not asking that much of you, Chris. And finally, filling up paid content with drivel or off-topic ramblings, despite the fact that his videos are advertised as around a minute in length on average, they can be longer in time length. Now, in spite of these issues, he has a continuing stream of customers. Or people. Now, listen, guys, stream of customers. Well, I can probably understand why, because I've said this a few times before. There are people out there who, one, have more money than sense, and there's also people out there who will just buy crap. And this is no exception. Meanwhile, a Kiwi Farms user named Vanilla Cone summed up the mindset of the lot with his review of the $50 paid video he ordered from Chris, which consisted of him being late, babbling to fill up time, failing to spell the recipient's name correctly, and delivering a video 39 seconds long out of a minimum of 1 minute. To be honest, I got what I expected out of the video, and money well spent in my opinion. Well, I'm glad he thinks about that. Not even some of the people on OnlyFans are nearly as shameless as $50 for 39 seconds. You have got to be kidding me. Chris joined Patreon on the 30th of November of 2016 as a response to pressure from the financial crisis. He initially set it up to beg for money. I'm surprised they bothered to give him an account at all for that, claiming that he would produce more Solitude comics if his fans paid off his mortgage and bills. Well, when you put it like that, it just makes sense not to do it. He was met with low support levels, generally below $40 per month. This suddenly changed, however, around June of 2017, picking up momentum from resuming the Solitude comic of his own volition in May. He revamped his Patreon to offer more reasonable support tiers for fans. He has enjoyed a significant uptick in support due to his continued work on the comic, earning around $500 to $600 per month. As his interest in his own comic has abated, and new pages more rarely released, Patreon support has shriveled to about a third of its peak. Reforming his backer awards by distinguishing different tiers for every dollar level given has not improved since his steady decline in support. This, of course, coming about through nobody's surprise, Chris failing to deliver orders. And how badly in terms of not giving out orders? Well, we'll take a look at that later again. Miscellaneous affairs. In May of 2016, Chris displayed a level of financial ignorance that shatters any hope of him ever becoming competent with money. Days after begging for donations to assist his ailing household, he announced that he would be starting his own business, with the declaration that each employee's salary would be 25% of the profit. Naturally, Chris completely fails to realize that under these conditions, he would have no money at all if he had more than 4 employees. However, that's just the tip of the iceberg. Days later, he uploaded a video attempting to go into business with Sega to create official Solitude products. In the video, he demands, and let's just say demand because let's face it, it really is that, a 6-figure salary along with full insurance benefits and maternity leave. These incidents seem to indicate Chris's belief that money comes out of nowhere and is unlimited in its value. 3 years later, in April of 2019, Solitude Entertainment of America was noted by Google Maps, prompting Chris to laud his company as legitimate in a video, though it would see no further activity. Or maybe it was just trolls pretending that it would. On the 24th of November 2016, Chris asked his audience to watch a clip of him playing Skylanders by uploading Quick vs. Coas in order to promote the idea of selling his in-game figure to help using the game's Skylanders creation app. He would charge $20 extra for his autograph. He also said, "I am not sharing my creation app Chirp," since this would allow people to order directly from Skylanders and cut off Chris's goal of profiting from his self-image. That seems almost like debasement if you ask me, but what do I know? On the 12th of January 2017, Chris uploaded Skylanders Imaginators leader Christine W. Chandler random review and stuff as an hour-and-a-half advertisement video showing off multiple Skylanders products he had ordered, a $15 card, a $30 t-shirt, and a $50 3D doll, all emblazoned with his avatar image, totaling at least $90. You see, what I feel like maybe a more creative type probably would have done is in some way used like the likeness of the image to sort of like simplify it and come up with slightly more original takes for ideas for merchandise. For example, like, you know how some of the icons for some of the Overwatch characters, you could get them on t-shirts and stuff like that? Why couldn't Chris have just sort of gone for a bit of a simpler approach, or, I don't know, even use the idea of the Skylanders almost as like a base, but do a little bit of twerking here and there, and gave it a bit more of a personality of its own, like an actual OC that even if you boiled it down, it would just come down to a custom character in Skylanders, but purely just as a base more than anything else. Part of me feels as if like probably Chris should have done stuff like that, so it looks a little less fraudulent than some other things he's come up with in the past. But of course, an 90, it's way like 90, even if it was $45, I think that's still way too much. Chris's largest business failure to date followed soon after. Various Skylander avatar products and a Sonchu figure were announced as prizes for a raffle Chris conceived, to push sale of his stamps. Slated to run from the 27th of March through to the 31st of April 2017, the cost of entry was buying one of Bob's stamps or Chris's stamp album on eBay, with a limit of one entry per buyer. Initially, Chris announced that the winner would receive a Sonchu figure and a Skylanders figure, and 15 runners-up would each receive a Skylanders card. A week later, he added more prizes to the mix, Skylanders t-shirts, and, well, I'm assuming for one reason or another, this would only really appeal to people who actually play Skylanders, and how much is that, really? Chris seemed to be banking on the $1,000 album selling, as it was the only scenario in which he could have shown a profit from the raffle. He promised an automatic win of a set of all three prizes. His expenditure for the raffle prizes totaled only $840, when no one bought the album and less than 15 people participated in the raffle. Although a mass buyer had purchased 18 stamps, he was left with a negative profit of $674.24. Chris probably would have Chris should have just gone down to a casino and put all that on red on a roulette table, and he probably would have come away with something resembling worth it in regards to time and money. In December of 2020, Chris teamed up with Praetor to produce more Sonichu medallions. The medallions are not created by Chris, but he supposedly oversees the design and production of the medallions. The medallions are of noticeably worse quality than those created by Chris, but that hasn't stopped the team from selling over 130 medallions as of the 14th of December 2020. The jointly owned Etsy page can be found right about here. Again, these things we'll have to discuss separately because this article is almost an hour in length already, and we're not even halfway through this. By May of 2022, the partnership with Praetor extended to selling monochrome artwork Chris had drawn whilst in jail. Naturally, given the newer delusions Chris had begun to machinate, if you will, shortly after ending up behind bars, these drawings primarily centered around his pseudo-religion. Or if by pseudo you mean cherry-pick influences from various other religions and sort of forced them together in some sort of like compact level of delusionary takes with influences snatched from the likes of Christianity, Islam, and I think Buddhism as well. Abortive ventures. In November of 2015, Chris announced that he would be setting up a shop on Zazzle.com. He mentioned it again half a year later, in June of 2016. When no progress was made, and to this day, Chris has never opened a Zazzle shop, so he basically lied, that's what he did. While he dragged his feet so much is unknown. Zazzle takes care of manufacturing and shipping, and there are no startup costs at all. All he would have to do is take some Sonichu drawings and upload them. In October of 2017, amid being the subject of interviews by Mary Weathery, Sachimo, and Copper Cab, Chris announced that he was open to being a guest on more interviews for payment. Well, I'm supposed so, but again, if this is anything to go by, you could probably work out that Chris does not exactly have a talent agent anywhere in the ballpark. Although he didn't specify his going rate. Mary Weathery mentioned that Chris had asked him for $200. He has since given interviews for free. Yeah, he probably doubled down from 200 to nothing. That's quite a negotiation. Taking the bend out of his potential scheme, although it seems that he was paid for the Create Unknown interview in October 2020. How much he was paid, we don't fully know. Customs and their reasons for buying. A piece of valuable internet culture. Internet culture, he says, aka anything else you can just sort of view online and not even have to give anybody a single cent. Doesn't exactly sound worth it when you think about it like that. While many who follow Chris refuse to give him money and shun those who do, buyers seem to regard Chris memorabilia as pieces of internet culture that might, they never will, but might become valuable over time. A February 2019 video in which a customer unboxed a Solitude Issue Zero comic printed for Lulu attracted over 100,000 views, and many commentators expressed a desire to buy for themselves. Ironically, the resulting bump in Chris's Patreon gave him so many orders to fulfill that he crashed into slumber and simply ignored the backlog of orders. That's just dumb to do that. I mean, I'm lost on that one. Ad revenue. When he was uploading the Solitude comic to the Wikipedia in 2009, the thought of monetizing his webcomic didn't cross his mind. People had been annoying, nay, harassing him with advertising he didn't approve of. Yet when he attempted to replace those offensive ads with the ads of his own, he simply put random advertisements on his webpage without actually signing any sort of advertisement contract. The ads didn't make him any money. There are several advertising programs that allow individual people to put ads on their personal pages and make money out of them. Some of these programs are even specifically geared toward webcomic artists. Many webcomics have a donation box where readers can donate money to the artist via PayPal or similar services. In 2016, Chris monetized his YouTube channel and added a support button, ostensibly to accept donations for Solitude projects. Even though he didn't want to work on that, he didn't want to, he just didn't. He flatline refused to it. And for a year, YouTube simply became another place from which he could beg for money. It took a little while for Chris to try drawing on camera in live drawing streams, and even then he hasn't demonetized it too often and has done an extremely poor job of it. Shock of all shocks. He simply sits in front of his PS4 camera, which is hard-coded to only record in flipped mirror mode, and is positioned so that viewers see an upside-down video set at a dizzying angle. Schedule slip. Most webcomics have a set schedule. Some upload weekly, some many times in a week, some even daily. Some webcomics update whenever the hell the artists do get inspiration enough to draw a comic, and probably reserve a whole form for people who whine about the lack of updates. Most webcomic artists, on the other hand, that do update the comic 3 times a week, consider that schedule to be very demanding. And webcomics that update daily usually generate revenue of some sort, be it ads, donations, print versions, merchandise, what have you, allowing the artists treat their comics like a full day job. These are called self-sufficient webcomics, such as Penny Arcade, XKCD, and Questionable Content. Chris has thoroughly embraced the point of view that the comic shouldn't have a set schedule and inspiration does not have a deadline. Exactly the sort of thing you want to say when you know you've got a mortgage to pay and you spend quite a lot of your time when you should be working on the comics begging for money, while also promising us that the comic would be updated daily. On the 14th of November 2009, Chris promised that the comic would be updated daily, and he managed to fulfill this promise for a while. By the end of Solitude issue 10, Chris was already placing author substitutes in the story, telling people to quit whining about the lack of updates. Now, this is obviously not a question of punctuality, but hypocrisy. Chris would avoid a lot of drama if he just admitted that there's no set schedule whatsoever after all. If one does consider this a question of punctuality, it doesn't look too good. Like, I once had this idea, ladies and gentlemen, that I was going to start up a Patreon again, but what I would actually do is upload it, well, by actually uploading some of my own short stories. And the beauty with this is that you can upload certain things daily, and you never know. If it gets a good enough review, people might simply take to the idea of, guess what? Maybe we'll request for him to do some short stories, and we'll see what happens. In fact, part of me suggests that actually, you know what? Because I am not exactly what you call short on stories. That's sort of been backlogged in hard drives for the last 5 years. But it's when you take it out to the public and see what they've got to say about it. That's when I think it becomes a bit of an interesting business venture. Chris also tends to update in spurts in an attempt to make up for missed days. Excuses, if you pardon the pun. This can range anywhere from 3 to 20 pages at a time. Now, most professional web cartoonists do have a buffer of guest comics so that they can avoid this sort of thing, but the thought of doing so has apparently never entered Chris's autistic mind. The same mindset also pervades every other aspect of his business, namely that Chris will procrastinate on shipping orders. A key example is how he almost messed up the Sonic Totem sale in which he received $1,500 for it, immediately wasted much of his profit on bling and failed to ship it out to the buyer on time, saying that he had run out of money to pay for mailing it, and only got around to having his mother scrounge up the cash to do so after the buyer filed a PayPal dispute. He also lost his Etsy shop as a direct result of his poor work ethic. Yeah, I think when that happens, ladies and gentlemen, I think this whole thing about inspiration coming up in spurts, it's not really a good look when this is supposed to be your job. But Chris has never really had a job that he held down anyway, nor it seemed he was particularly any use whilst he was technically employed. I think the way you want to look at stuff like this is that it demands an awful lot of work. And Chris is, unfortunately, one of those people who will say again and again and again that there are two types of people out there in this world, ladies and gentlemen. Those who can't or won't, whilst others can and do. And Chris is definitely the first two. Either Chris can't or won't be bothered. I think it's both, to be honest, because it's definitely not the other two. Pipe dreams. When do you want Nintendo and Sega to talk to me to evolve Solitude and Rosechew more realistically? Now! Chris demanding, yes, we're using the word demanding again, that multinational corporation takes orders from a complete and utter nobody. Chris has had numerous aspirations to work in the creative industries. So far, he has expressed his desire to make several official Solitude video games and work on a real Solitude comic for a real comic publisher. However, for reasons best known to only himself, he elects not to find out how any of these industries actually work, which is quite strange, really. One would assume that a person seeking a career in the industries would at least take some effort to find out how the said industries work. But again, I think the only thing Chris seems to be interested in is, well, making money off Solitude so he doesn't have to bother anymore. Yeah. Official publication. In the Solitude Chronicles and Chris's resume, it's revealed that Chris is under the impression that his art isn't just good, but professional quality, and that he aspires to get into the comics and video game business. When you hear something like that, it does make you raise an eyebrow and say, has Chris actually ever read any other comics in his time? Now, again, the subject, it's a subjective thing when you want to talk about art, not the sort of thing you want to be talking about when, if you wanted to have it published and taken as, face value that it's done professionally, then expect it to get judged and reviewed professionally. And I think also the pricing for whatever this comic would have sold at would have reflected this this belief in his professionalism. Nothing else about Chris seems to reflect professionalism, so why are we expected to say Chris's comic would ever would, regardless of its artistic merits in the loosest term possible? The resume itself reveals his widely varied skills with both pens and crayons, and his desire to work as an artist for a professional comic company such as Archie Comics or Marvel, creating his own Sonichu comics. There is no word on whether or not he actually submitted anything to these companies or if they ever replied. I or if anything, they may have like pinned them to a notice board in the canteen saying, if you ever feel down in the world, then just remember you're still probably better from somebody who was being serious. I hope they didn't do that, but you know. Unfortunately for Chris, the publishing industry does not work in this way, especially not in the case of original creations. In the case of original work, the publishers accept complete works to be submitted to them, usually through an agent. An agent's job is to separate the wheat from the chaff and find the correct publisher for the work, taking a small percentage of the eventual profit for their reward. Yeah, royalty fees. If the publishers take unsolicited submissions, they have to sift through a gigantic backlog, often called slush pile of submissions, of highly varying quality, most of which end up in the rejected pile multiple times before there will be a publisher with their right market in mind and the right publication schedule to allow the publication deal to go forward. The whole process can take years in the case of a single body of work. Now, whilst before we do continue, there are two examples of this to varying degrees. One more literate and one slightly less so, but it is a good second to bring up. Now, the first is that tell me if any of you guys have ever heard of the manga series Bokumon. Not Bokugon, Bokumon. Because I'm pretty sure I can't remember if it's done by the same artist and writer who went on to who did Death Note. But for those who don't know, Bokumon is quite literally the story about the beginnings of actually trying to get into the manga industry in Japan, and how you get hundreds of thousands of writers and artists who will submit their work to the likes of Shonen Jump or to some larger outlet just to get their stories featured. And editors literally run round the block trying to say, what's the best one going? Is this going to work? No, is this going to work? I don't know if this one's going to work, but you know what? Print that one instead. And yeah, I don't. Chris probably should have done because I haven't read that series in about like 12 years now, but yeah, it can sometimes be hell on earth to be accepted, or to even get a job as an editor, for if anything else. Now, as to whether or not actually getting it out there in terms of like Patreon or going independent before being picked up, it's a very, very good question, and I sadly don't really have the answer to that. But again, you would have to go through the ranks of like an editor or something like that. Now, the only other thing I wanted to mention is that it was about this time last year that I watched all 12 episodes of High Guardian Spice. Many call it an anime. I personally don't. I think it's only really an anime insofar as there are ideas and themes that seem to be tangentially related to anime, but that's about as far as it's go, and it's a pretty loose way to put it in any case. But what I want to emphasize is this: apparently, the creator behind High Guardian Spice, this was apparently the sixth time they published their work to a commissioning editor before Crunchyroll, and I don't really think Crunchyroll really they kind of had that reputation for the whole thing about High Guardians. Because listen, High Guardian Spice is not a good show. I'm just putting it out there. I would know. I watched the whole thing myself, and there because the egotism behind a lot of the people. Because I knew, well, not personally, but I know fine well one of the one of the actual directors of the program who did a lot of shows throughout the 2000s, mostly for Nickelodeon. And she actually has quite a good resume for shows that she, I think she was like production manager or something like that. But at the same time, she also was, managing director for quite a lot of slop with Nickelodeon. Fanboy and Chum Chum, I think like certain episodes of Sanjay and Craig. So it's quite hit or miss. But what I'm trying to say is that, and something that has occurred to me while I was watching is that when the creator submitted their work for the sixth time to try and get this get this production started, was the sixth draft exactly the same as the first draft? Because something tells me it was. And this is something you would have to possibly uncover for yourselves if you ever have the interest of watching Heidi Guardian Spice. I've got 12 videos of my own on one of my other channels where I talked about the entire show from start to finish. And even though it's a show that, to be honest, somebody would have to pay me about like £100 or something like that to go back and watch, because I am not going back to that show again. Because that show has already taken away almost half my brain, so I'm not gonna like do it again. But it does raise the question about some work does get picked up sooner or later, but I also wonder, maybe it's possibly true that the word change is made, in which case the original draft must have been an entirely different beast. But there are some people who do take it up at some point. Moving on. If comic book publishers have salaried artists, they usually need to have a portfolio of previous work, usually work that has already been published commercially. If the comic house is particularly lenient, and most big names sadly aren't, there has to be evidence of a successfully self-published, high-quality comic, and even in this case, these artists usually only work on characters and plot lines that come from inside the house. It can take time before the artist is in any position to present their own ideas for comics, or use their own original characters. The exceptions to the rule are literally people who literally come out the gates and they work literally round the clock in the vein that they can get their work out to like not only the right sort of people, but also deliver it to a demographic that immediately picks up on this sort of thing. Now there are some artists who gain an immediate following, but these are the sorts of artists that probably do it for one specific reason, or something about their art sticks out to people immediately. I'm not saying it's probably what you think it is, however, it's somebody who understands also why it works and what draws people to it. As they do say, sex doesn't sell, porn sells. And again, whether you want to say it's this case or the other, well, more often than not, those are the sorts of people that have to go to like different outlets and stuff like that to get their work published. But it does happen. It's just, it has to really stand out. Even if he were able to stick in a company for a long time, he'd still need to improve his communication skills a lot. If the Solitude Chronicles PowerPoint and various phone conversations are any indication, he's unable to persuade his superiors that his ideas are worth working on. In short, Chris is deluded. If he thinks that any company will just pick him up and tell him to work on Solitude comics. Even if Chris does get in, he never will, there's also the big problem with scheduling. Most comics are worked on far in advance, thus allowing for any changes concerning a book, such as plot problems, character availability changes, or even cancellations. Even so, many of them maintain a certain schedule either monthly or bi-monthly, sometimes quarterly. Very rarely do comics go bi-weekly, one every 2 weeks. Though weekly series have been more common, though infrequent. DC Comics, for example, experimented with the weekly format in the 1980s with Action Comics Weekly, an anthology which bombed and put the title on hiatus for a few months, returning to its normal Action Comics title and monthly format. 20 years later, DC has churned out a number of weekly series, including 52, Countdown, Trinity, and more recently, the new 52, Future's End. Here's a quick summary for all of these. Sucked, bombed, didn't really work out the way they wanted it to, and also sucked. Yeah, listen, I've read all of these, by the way, and they're not good, sadly. Chris, however, has no schedule. His schedule consists of whenever he has the inspiration to work. That does not cut it, especially if you want to be paid like anything close to what Chris was demanding. If Chris went with that alone, he would have a release schedule that would rival Rob Liefeld and Valve. And where Liefeld, for the most part, could get away with it because he owned his own company at one point, and people have gotten him to actually do the work, if Chris pulled this kind of stunt, he'd be out on the street so fast his head would spin. Chris's understanding of copyright is a chapter in itself. Publishers want primarily original works, because securing the necessary rights to publish derivative works is often difficult or impossible. Chris has even resisted attempts to educate him in this regard. Something you would have thought Chris just would have pounced on the opportunity, considering it concerned something of his own interests. For example, on the 14th of August 2017, Chris uploaded a video where he updated the true and loyal fan base on his progress on Sonichu issue 13, which he has renumbered as Sonichu 12-9. He states that he decided to change the focus of the comic, instead of being a crossover between the Solitude Gang and the Planet Dolan crew. It would be instead a fan fiction devoted to his pony avatar Nightstar. Throughout the video, he mentions how he only wants the comic to be a piece of fan fiction, but now he also wants it to be canon to My Little Pony, where he himself would voice Nightstar. Of course, Chris doesn't seem to realize that the creators of the show can't simply pick up his idea because, as stated earlier, it may lead to an accusation of idea theft. Yet another reason why the publishing industry wouldn't accept Sonichu in its current state is because of how sloppily written and egocentric it is in tone. If a publisher somehow did agree to make Sonichu comics, they would more likely task other writers, not to mention artists, with actual talents to shape up the premise into something at least passable. Predictably enough, Chris would balk at lacking control over his life's work, and of course, anyone doing better than him. Games and merchandise. Chris would approach Sega and Nintendo and ask them to make Sonichu games, comics, and merchandise. This plan would also be doomed to failure because no media companies want unsolicited ideas from the public. There are several reasons for this. First of all, it takes effort to sift through idea piles, and they can't give an equal amount of thought on the countless ideas fans send them. While game companies may listen to their fans, they usually just want to know if the time is right for something they've been planning to do. For example, no doubt a big part of the reason why the newer Fire Emblem games got worldwide release was that the fans of Marth and Roy from Super Smash Bros. Melee were wondering around, why the hell isn't Nintendo releasing these games outside of Japan? They most certainly don't have the capacity of starting a whole new game project just because somebody asks. If the game companies respond by saying Chris had, as he himself so eloquently put, rocks in his head, then you can probably understand why they don't get a slice of their precious time for making a second impression. Simply put, Chris thinks that even that the companies aren't busy with other projects, they still have time to think of his grandiose ideas and those things only. Second, there is the age-old problem of in a litigious society. A fan writes to the company and says, I have this cool idea. The company says, thanks, but no thanks. One of the in-house writers comes up with exactly the same idea, maybe completely by accident, and boom, you have a fan who's suing you for idea theft. And even if that lawsuit will usually go nowhere, it wastes perfectly usable time, energy, and most of all money that could be used for more fruitful ventures. A famous example is of the British novelist Terry Pratchett, who used to post in his Uniset fan group until one of these fans was convinced Terry had stolen his ideas. Therefore, most media houses will usually say they will not take any ideas from the public. The game industry is no exception. The fact is that it has been pointed out to Chris numerous times, and at least twice by real Nintendo representatives, as evidenced by the letters he read in the captain's logs. Unfortunately, Chris had completely misinterpreted all of this. How he managed to misinterpret this, I have absolutely no idea. Another thing that Chris disregards is the fact that writing games takes an awful lot of effort. In Thomas Edison's words, getting things done is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. Many good ideas don't come implemented. No one is going to invest energy in developing an idea alone if they don't know if the idea can be implemented. Game companies, for example, may be willing to negotiate a deal to use their properties, such as characters, in games developed by third parties, but those proposals are usually backed by real companies, actual creative teams of developers, and serious complete plans for games, if not outright working prototypes already. Even in the case the properties are tacked on prototype later on. The prototypes are usually fully developed so that they can be used without these properties, if the plans fall through. For example, Star Fox Adventures began as a game that was completely unrelated to the Star Fox universe, but Nintendo felt the game was better with Star Fox characters. Surprisingly, in the homemade Nintendo Power magazine, then high schooler aged Chris offered a slightly better description of how three fictional Sonic games releases he hoped would play out than his proposals for Solitude games. Later on, and even then, they're highly basic and unoriginal ideas. For example, Super Mario 64 with Sonic the Hedgehog as its playable character, and Super Mario All Stars with the four classic Sonic games originally for the Sega Genesis. Even though technically Sonic would get like the Sonic Masters collection for the PS2, which comprised of, I believe, about 14 Sega games from the Genesis, the Saturn, um, even like the Nep Gear, all the way up to I think everything pre Dreamcast, to my knowledge. And they would also offer like a few other, like two other games for the Genesis and stuff like that. Completely unrelated to Sonic, but they felt like it'll probably make more sense to put them on that disc anyway. Theoretically, it would be possible, though extraordinarily unlikely, for Sega and Nintendo to cooperate enough to make a game featuring a Sonic/Pikachu hybrid named Sonichu. They, of course, would not do this. However, need for any input from Chris, or even his permission to combine characters that they already own, well, think about it. Of course, the idea of releasing it cross platform for Sony consoles remains yet another absurd and feathered dream on any part of Chris. In the case of the Solitude Chronicles, he gives Shigeru Miyamoto permission to use the cover of his hand-drawn Nintendo Power magazine as the inevitable cover for when his game is created, even though it's several years old, and in fact, even worse than Chris's current art skills. And also to the surprise of nobody, Chris has held on to dreams of Sonichu getting turned into a video game character well into November of 2023, when he posted a request to personally work with Nintendo, offering them his OCs to be integrated into Pokemon canon. Equally unsurprising is that Chris seems to be unaware, willfully or otherwise, that Nintendo has nothing to gain by granting fans ludicrous desires for all the releases mentioned here. In general, an issue where Chris would face in these industries that he aspired to work towards is that mainstream publishers will not allow any pornographic material which Chris had nonchalantly drawn into his supposedly kid-friendly comic. Thus, Chris would be forced to comply with a set of rules to make his magnum opus acceptable for the masses. And I think it's fair to say we all know how well that would turn out. By a similar token, both Nintendo and Sega would probably not allow the extremely violent and sexual imagery that the comic does not shy away from, especially since he considers Sonichu appropriate for kids. No, no, Chris, it's because they're not. Although he did imagine his adult chronicles to be rated M for honest content, and that's if they didn't reject it outright because of said imagery. Not to mention, Chris had drawn smut of his magnum opus himself in the past, which could have made a bad first impression on any reputable company that approached to work with him. Not to mention, again, that Chris, being the egotist that we all know and love, would have to essentially hand over the rights for Sonichu to whichever company agrees to own his IP, meaning he would have little to no say on how it plays out according to his whims. This this naturally would be well enough if Chris was being paid royalties for all of this. But again, if the game flops and absolutely nobody buys into the idea of Sonichu as anything legitimate, of course Sega or Nintendo won't be able to afford to keep up their end of the bargain when it comes to royalties and will just relinquish the rights back over to Chris, which basically tells Chris something very, very clear. Even a professional company or companies couldn't make Sonichu work. So, what exactly does Chris have on his own or has to contribute? We all know it would never get to that stage anyway. But oh well, who am I to hammer it on to Chris even further? If Chris actually were in a position of creative control, considering this, during the majority of the time the Wikipedia was online, Chris acted as if he had free reign to dictate a site others made and hosted for him. So letting him be head honcho of a comic or game production would be a colossal mistake. Needless to say, the stress of working under him would lead some unfortunate writers, developers, to quit and or have higher ups to eventually fire him. The future of Chris and his business attempts. Now, after the life-changing incest scandal in the middle of summer of 2021, Prater successfully continued business with Chris, selling drawings he had made during incarceration, and since his release from jail, a further run of medallions and other assorted junk, as well as setting up live streams. And as far as we're concerned, Chris, although not necessarily too prosperous, is technically still in business to this day? Question mark. But it does go without saying, ladies and gentlemen, is that Chris certainly does still make money. Some may argue it seems a little unfair, considering that why should Chris be paid for any of this? But well, what can I say? Life is just kind of unfair sometimes. But life goes on. And speaking of life going on, that is all we've got time for tonight. And I hope all of you guys enjoyed this article of Chris and his attitude to business. And I hope all of you may have learned something new from all of this. And I will see all of you guys again next time. Thank you.